Okay, this is part one of chapter four. In this chapter, we're going to cover really the earliest well-developed criminological theory, um, and contrast that a little bit with other theories. But we're just kind of following the author here, who's going in a bit of a chronological order of different theories. So don't make the mistake of thinking that we're somehow going in a best to worst or worst to best sort of direction. It's kind of chronological, the oldest ones first. Now, even though the author doesn't mention it, perhaps the earliest naturalist theory of crime is Plato's view that people do wrong out of a lack of knowledge. So, a couple of points here. By naturalistic theory, we mean, we've referred to this before, theories that are scientific. And what we mean by scientific is um, theories that rely on observable facts to explain behavior. Uh, so observable is one way to put it. Another way to put it is down to earth. So we're not using supernatural explanations. We're not using spiritual or religious explanations, because again, those realms are kind of beyond the senses, beyond the realm of the senses. And a scientific approach relies on the senses, meaning sight, sight, various types of observation to gain knowledge. And so now, observation doesn't have to be direct, like with actually seeing crimes with your own eyes. But we often in criminology we use indirect observation, like asking people to tell us in an anonymous, confidential way where they're not going to get in trouble for it, to tell us what bad things, criminal things they have done. And so we're relying on their observations, what they've seen, as opposed to what, since we haven't seen it, we're relying on their information. Or if you're asking victims about being a victim of a crime, what they observed. So that's an example of a naturalistic approach, is we don't rely on spiritual, supernatural explanations that can't be observed, things that are beyond this physical world and are not really subject to scientific study. Now, Plato, we're talking about one of the earliest sort of professional philosophers from ancient Greece, who lived in like 5th century uh, um, BC in ancient Greece. And so, we're talking about somebody who developed a criminological theory about, roughly speaking, 2,500 years ago. And you always had, as we talked about in the previous chapter, you always had explanations for crime, but they were usually more of a spiritual or supernatural kind of explanation. But Plato, in this early scientific tradition, brought it down to earth, and he really blamed crime on what we might call ignorance. Ignorance meaning lack of knowledge. He hypothesized that as you gain knowledge and understanding of the world, basically in education, that that superior knowledge prevents you and helps you see the irrationality of committing crimes. And so you don't commit crimes because you have a lot of knowledge. And on the flip side, if you're a very uneducated, ignorant person who doesn't know much, that you're going to be prone to crime. Now, it is true that there is a correlation between being more educated and being less involved in crime. So there is a correlation currently in the current world. But this theory is one that was really never really developed, and it certainly has a weakness that research shows that just because you know more information, because you're better educated, it doesn't necessarily convince you to obey the law. It may, for example, just give you more knowledge about how to break the law intelligently in a more sophisticated way where you won't get caught. So I think there's certainly some truth to Plato's view, but it's a theory that was really never developed and hasn't been pursued too much. But I would say a limitation of this ancient approach is that research shows that if you want to take sort of an extreme example of like serial killers or psychopaths, a lot of times those people might know quite a bit and have quite a bit of understanding. They might be intelligent, they could even be educated, but that knowledge doesn't really convince them not to commit crimes. They know a lot, but they just commit the crimes anyway. So it doesn't make the knowledge doesn't necessarily make you care. It doesn't make you necessarily sensitive to the needs, the rights, the feelings of victims. It doesn't really necessarily make you a moral person. There's research that shows that educated people are not necessarily that much more moral than anybody else. More knowledgeable, yes, but not necessarily that much more ethical or moral. It's kind of a different quality to be moral. Anyway, but that's not too important for this chapter. I thought I would just introduce it since we're kind of starting out with old theories. This one is like truly old, going back more than 2 millennia. Now, if we want to talk about the first big theoretical perspective, which is still with us today and has been developed over the centuries, we need to go back to what's come to be known as the classical school of criminology that was developed by mostly 2 scholars who lived in the late 1700s, around the time of the American Revolution, late 1700s, around 1800. And those 2 scholars are Jeremy Bentham and Caesar Beccaria. And these two, Jeremy Bentham from England and Caesar Beccaria from Italy. Now, these 2 were scholars, were thinkers, were writers, and they were reformers because both of them in their own countries looked at the pretty brutal, harsh, inhumane criminal justice policies that were followed in their countries. And in the 1700s, you had a lot of brutality. You had people convicted of crimes being tortured, lots of executions, and just really inhumane treatment of criminals, and also a problem with the criminals who were convicted but were actually innocent, and so not having a criminal justice system that was very good at getting justice and punishing the guilty but making sure that the innocent go free. So they saw a lot of problems. Bottom line, they saw a lot of problems in their systems. They saw them as being inhumane, sort of barbaric, outdated, old-fashioned, and in need of serious reform. So they were reformers, um, as well as social scientists, meaning trying to explain crime with a criminological theory. So they've got a couple of roles that they're playing. The one that we're going to focus on in this class, since we are so interested with theories of crime in this class, we're going to focus on their theoretical approaches to crime. And here, really, it's Bentham that's sort of the leader in explaining crime and developing a theory or an approach to humans to understanding what makes them tick and why they behave like they do. So, especially Jeremy Bentham started this classical school. And this classical school, Bentham said, uh, you know, what makes humans different than animals? Well, we're rational, we're smart, we deliberate before we make decisions, we weigh the pros and the cons. And so he assumed that humans are rational and calculating. And by calculating, he means that you look at the pros, you look at the cons, you decide, which is weighs heavier. And if it looks like there overall is a payoff to a certain behavior, then you go ahead and engage in that certain behavior. If there's not a payoff in your mind, according to your perception, there's not a payoff, then you're not going to engage in that behavior. So this perspective, which was just, again, just beginning to be developed a couple hundred years ago, came to be known as rational choice theory. They didn't call it that back then, but that's the name that it has now. And so you could see how the name of it makes some sense because of this rational choice, that the idea that humans will weigh their options before they behave, and that they're rational. That's what they mean by rational thinking, deliberating before they act. And not only did Bentham develop sort of this approach about understanding human nature and what makes humans tick, he also developed an ethical system, which is based on the principle of utility. And so he said whether something is good or not depends on whether it benefits uh, the majority, the most people in society. So if you have a social policy, a way of doing things that brings most happiness, most benefit to the greatest number of people in your society, well, then that's a good policy. But if you have policies that don't maximize the happiness of your citizens, well, then that's a bad policy. So he had an ethical system as well as a kind of theory of human behavior. As a matter of fact, this theory of human behavior was so powerful and so persuasive and convincing that that Jeremy Bentham is basically one of the founders of economics, because this is very much an economic way of looking at human beings, rational, calculating, looking at the pros of and cons. And you can see how this sort of approach could be applied to money and economic transactions, buying things, selling things, earning money, getting a job, salary increases, on and on and on. This idea that humans weigh the pros and the cons and they try to maximize or optimize the good things. To even get a little more precise about it, Bentham said that humans have two masters, pleasure and pain, and that we are sort of naturally designed, naturally wired to pursue pleasurable things, pleasant things, and to avoid as much as possible painful things. And those are very powerful motivators. We're wired that way. And so when we weigh the pros and cons, the benefits and the costs of behavior, we're really looking at, is this behavior going to make me feel good? Is it going to make me happy? Is it going to make me satisfied? Or is it going to cause me pain, distress, suffering, trouble, that kind of thing? So really at the core, you can see this as a perspective about uh, pursuing pleasurable things, avoiding painful things in a rational, calculating sort of way. And also applying that to ethics, that you want maximum happiness, maximum pleasure, minimal suffering for your society. So that's basically Bentham right there. Very influential in ethics, very influential in economics, and influential in criminology too. So this school that we call the classical school of criminology, it emphasized free will, and you'll see this a lot in textbooks as you study this in this course or other courses. You'll see that there's this sort of talk of free will. They call this rational choice theories with emphasis on choice. So you can get the impression from actual criminologists and textbooks themselves that this approach, this rational choice approach, is different from every other theory that we'll cover in this class, because every other theory that we'll cover says that something causes you to commit crime, whatever that is. Different theories point to different factors, but generally speaking, traditional theories say that there are factors that cause you to commit crimes. And so some people like to present this theory as being unique because it's focusing on free will, free choice, as opposed to um, factors causing you to act in a criminal, illegal fashion. But really, this is a little bit of my opinion here, or my perspective. Take it for what it's worth. That I think that that's an inaccurate way of portraying the this theory, because this theory, I think, is really in its essence is the same as other theories. That it says this theory would say, why does someone commit a crime? Because they perceive a payoff. But so let's say that there's that there's $10,000 that's left open in a safe at your work, and or even some situation where, let's say you're like an accountant, and that that you can steal this money and hide the fact that you stole it, and you're very confident that you're never going to get caught, you're going to get away with it, you're looking at all the pros and cons, There's going to be you're highly confident that there's no punishment, nobody will ever know. It's quick, huge amount of cash in your pocket without any effort or trouble. So that person may not have much of a conscience, may not have much of an ethical system. And so they look at all these factors and they go ahead and they make this decision to steal that $10,000 from work. Now, there is a choice there. The person could do it or not do it, or they could decide, are they going to do it now, or maybe they might do it, but they'll wait till later. See, they've got various options here. But what they don't control is their environment. What they don't control is this opportunity. The fact that they happen to be at a job in a situation where, due to circumstances beyond their control, there's an opportunity where they can commit the crime and they're guaranteed that they're not going to get caught. And that there's some reason why this person is lacking a conscience. Why don't they feel some conviction that it's wrong to steal this money? It's not theirs. They didn't earn it, but they don't feel bad about that. Why don't they feel bad about that? A lot of us would feel bad about it and not commit the crime even though we could, because we know it's wrong, and that means something to us. So even though this person makes a choice, you can explain his choice, his decision making, based on these external factors that he does not control, that he did not bring into being. He didn't bring that situation into being, that opportunity, that temptation into being. And you could also get into various reasons why he doesn't have any qualms about doing that. Maybe he wasn't raised right, or to develop a conscience. So there's some defect in his mental development. So what's my point here? My point here is that this theory, this approach, like any other approach, says that you do things for reasons, that there are factors that drive your behavior, and you respond to incentives, you respond to disincentives, you respond to benefits, and you respond to costs, benefits and costs that you don't create. And so what's my point here? My point is, I don't think that this theory is not really different than any other theory that we'll cover in this class. There's this view in criminology and the social sciences that's called positivism. And this is the view that people can be studied scientifically like any other part of nature. So they got this idea that science can create knowledge in any area of life, any area of nature or our existence, humans as well as anything else. You can apply science to humans just like you could apply it to the earth, to animals, to the solar system, through the universe, at the chemical level, the biological level, whatever. Positivism says you can do this, use the same methods, the scientific methods, and learn about what makes humans tick and why they behave like they do. And when people think of positivism, most criminologists, they'll think of someone like a biological approach. They might think of Darwin, who saw humans as being one more species of animals, a certain type of primate, and that humans, like all other life forms, were descended from earlier life forms, and that our behavior is determined by evolutionary processes and biological processes. So people like to think of that this kind of theory is a positivistic one, and criminologists will compare and contrast a positivistic point of view with this rational choice theory. And they'll say, well, these are fundamentally different approaches, because rational choice theory is a free will theory, whereas a positivistic approach like Darwin's approach is more what they would call deterministic. It's a scientific approach which says that X causes Y. Criminological theories in general, this would be a claim that I would make, and here I'm departing a little bit from the textbook, so stick with me on this. If there's ever any difference between the textbook and me, stick with me on this when it comes to testing, because I'll give preference to sort of, how I come down on these things, although I certainly test and give full respect to anything from the textbook too. Anyway, criminological theories in general are deterministic or probabilistic. And what I mean by that is this next sentence here. All of these theories, rational choice included, they claim that there is some X, some factor, or maybe a set of factors, a set of X's that cause crime. We'll talk in this throughout the semester about theories that say, well, crime comes from hanging out with the wrong kind of friends, or watching violent movies or TV, or playing violent video games, for example. That causes crime, or that you're raised in an abusive situation, that's child abuse that causes crime, or you'll have some you know biological theories that will say that brain dysfunction, something wrong with the brain, will lead to crime. Lots of different things we'll talk about throughout this semester. Drug abuse or alcoholism leads to violence, that kind of stuff. All of these are claims that there's different factors that um, raise the risk that you'll commit crimes. They're not deterministic in that if you have this characteristics, guaranteed you're going to be a criminal. Like, you don't have a theory that'll say guaranteed if you're the victim of child abuse that you're going to grow up and become some hardcore violent criminal. These social science theories, none of them say that if X, then Y, guaranteed. If you're an alcoholic, guaranteed you're going to be violent. Because for one thing, criminologists know that that's not true, and that at best, at most, these factors are correlated with criminal behavior. They raise the probability, they raise the chance that you'll be a criminal. So if you're a victim of child abuse, it doesn't guarantee you're going to be a criminal, but it does raise the risk, raises the chance that you'll develop into becoming a criminal. So what I mean by that, in other words, is you could be someone who is the victim of child abuse, and so the data, the studies show that you have a 20% chance of becoming a serious criminal, and that's a child that grows up in a supportive, non-abusive home, a healthy home, the kind of home you want kids raised in, has a 5% chance of becoming a criminal. I'm just speaking hypothetically here, that this is coming from data, this is coming from a study. I'm making this up. So you see that's 20% chance versus 5% chance. For neither type of child is it 100% chance you can become a criminal, but there's 20% chance is 4 times bigger than 5% chance. So you can see that with this example, that being a victim of child abuse raises the chances, the odds that you become a criminal. All of our theories are probabilistic like that, but they are still deterministic in a certain sense. Be careful not to be misled by what I'm saying here. What they're all saying is that there are factors that influence your behavior and influence what you become and influence how you act. And the different theories will point to different factors, but they all point to factors, all of them. And rational choice theory is no different. They point to factors that are incentives, benefits to crime, or on the flip side, they'll point to costs, to cons, to things that convince you not to commit crimes because they make you convinced it's not worth it. All incentives and disincentives, those are all factors just like any other theory. So the way I see it anyway is that classical theory is no exception. It's the main difference between classical school of criminology and other theories we'll talk about throughout the semester is that this theoretical perspective sees humans as being much more calculating, more deliberative, that they think things through more carefully before they behave. Some of these other theories will see humans as being less deliberative. They won't think through their behavior. They're more instinctive. They do stuff without thinking. So both types of theories look at factors, but rational choice theory sees human beings as being going through the pros and the cons before you act. So it sees humans as kind of being smarter, more rational than some of the other theories, which don't give humans quite that much credit. So that's the main difference, is just how much credit do you give humans to think through their behavior, right? This one thinks that humans think a lot before acting, which is sometimes true and sometimes not true, because sometimes people do act very spontaneously and don't think before they act, and get themselves in trouble sometimes by being spontaneous. Other people are much more calculating and don't do anything without planning carefully and thinking it through. So individuals are different on this question of how calculating people are. So that would be one weakness of this kind of approach, is not everybody's the same. Not everybody's highly calculating. Some people are, some people aren't. So free will is not a scientific idea. In this course, we will not be um, we won't focus on a free will view of crime, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. You should consider this as being one option, and I'm not here to tell you how to think about these things. I lay out the full menu of ideas, and you take home with you what you're convinced by. But a free will perspective, which we won't emphasize this semester, what it says is if it's trying to answer the question of why people commit crimes, it's a very, very simple theory. It says people commit crimes because they want to. That's the end of the story. They choose to do it, but why did they do it? They do it because they want to do it, and they choose to do it. End of story. Time to go home. And that's free will. Free will is not X leads to Y, or X raises the chances of Y. That's scientific kind of thinking. And when I say scientific, I'm not saying that that's the way you have to think and that you can't think in terms of free will. But the free will idea is something that comes more from philosophy, from religion, from humanities possibly, but a scientific view, where this positivistic view where you're trying to explain Y's with X's, that this leads to that, right? That if the apple gets loose from the tree, gravity is going to pull it to the ground. Um, that's the way science look at things. That whatever it is you're studying gets pulled and pushed wherever it goes. It doesn't have free will to move itself there. Apples don't have a free will to choose to fall to the ground. That's not a scientific kind of idea. So science sees humans as being like pawns on a chessboard. Imagine pieces on a chessboard getting moved around. So where you end up in life is where you got moved to. So you have some external force that's pushing and pulling you around the chessboard. It's not a free will thing. You're getting pushed and pulled. That's a scientific type of approach. And again, you can question that. You can wonder, you can decide for yourself how you want to look at things. Myself, I tend to look at it's like my approach tends to be all of the above, that I see truth in quite a few different things. And so I think that humans do have a lot of choice and a lot of options and should be responsible for their behavior and held accountable for their behavior. But at the same time, we are pushed and pulled by different factors. There are things that increase our odds of becoming criminals or reduce our odds of being criminals. All that I think is true too. Anyway, hopefully you understand some of these points that I'm making that departs a little bit from what you typically get in these chapters. But just it's early on here. I always want to warn students. Listen, all semester long, and in any class you take, in just about any social science class around campus, doesn't not just criminology, just about any subject matter. You're going to tend to get the story that people are like they are because they get pushed and pulled around by external forces, by forces outside of their free will. And that's the message you're going to get this semester. And you should feel free to sort of, pick and choose or take home with you whatever you find most convincing and persuasive. And don't believe it just because I'm saying it, because it's in the textbook. You need to use your own um, judgment on these things. That's at least my attitude towards it. Okay, now in this we'll finish up with this final point, and then we'll pick up on the next in the next segment. So you had in the late 1700s Bentham and Beccaри's approach, this classical approach. But then later in the 1800s, more like roughly mid 1800s, you got this new school of thought, which was what came to be known as the cartographic criminology. and researchers like this Quetelet, French guy. Um, what they did is that they would map different neighborhoods, cities throughout Europe, and notice that some neighborhoods, some cities, some regions had a lot more crime, a lot more homicide, and other regions much more peaceful and less criminal. And so they began to look at these patterns and try to explain why was it that Paris, had so much more crime than the country out in the small towns and the rural farm areas. They had much less crime. What's going on there? How come it's all in the cities? And so they were looking at sort of geographic differences in crime, regional differences in crime, using maps and using data, this is the sort of the beginning of using statistics to figure out patterns and to give us clues about what's causing people to commit crimes. Why is it happening in the cities much more than in the small towns? Those sorts of questions started to be asked by these kind of researchers, these kind of thinkers. And it brought statistics into the discipline where we start looking at numbers, a kind of a systematic measurement of everything to figure out what's going on, as opposed to just relying on our hunches or what we gather about stuff and maybe not being very accurate and precise about exactly what's going on out there. So this brought some precision, some quantification, turning things into numbers, statistical analysis into what we do in criminology. So according to this tradition, social forces like urban poverty cause crime. So it's again, this is a positivistic, like all these theories, scientific theories, is it looked at cities and says, okay, well, the reason why you get uh, more crime in this city versus that city is that this city has more of its people are desperate or are poor, are unemployed, who don't have enough money to make ends meet. So we think that it's the level of poverty going on in the city. If there was less poverty, there'd be less crime. That kind of thinking that there's factors that drive, push, and pull people towards criminality. So again, this is another example of this positivistic scientific kind of approach, which is what you're going to get throughout the semester. So we'll leave it right there. We'll continue on later with part 2.